Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into the practical implications of the FDA's final guidance on computer software assurance, or CSA, for production and quality system software. This was published, September 24th, 2025. And it's a big deal because it effectively supersedes the older, much more prescriptive validation methods from the previous software validation guidance. It really represents a monumental shift in how medical device manufacturers need to allocate resources, and importantly, how they demonstrate compliance.
Right, it is a monumental shift, and this aim for a risk-based, least burdensome approach, well, it's been widely applauded, I think. Across the industry, the intent seems clear. Move away from generating, reams of unnecessary documentation from just rote, scripted testing.
Absolutely. And I think the core tension we really face now, the central question for today, is whether this new framework actually succeeds. Does it successfully align the validation rigor directly with true patient safety and product quality risk, maximizing efficiency?
Or does its reliance on, let's say, qualitative risk classification, a lot of discretionary judgment, and these non-traditional evidence-gathering methods, does that introduce new layers of complexity, ambiguity even? Ultimately, does it make the audit trail less robust and maybe create greater compliance exposure?
Well, from my perspective, I'll be arguing that CSA is a necessary evolution. It's modern, it's efficient, especially for the quality professional. I believe it successfully reduces that documentation burden by focusing assurance efforts where they really belong, commensurate with the actual risk the software function poses to the product.
And I'll be approaching this naturally from the perspective of an auditor. My argument is that this pretty dramatic shift toward qualitative interpretation and moving away from consistent, objective, scripted evidence, well, it complicates the ability to efficiently and objectively audit the sufficiency of assurance. It demands, frankly, an intense and probably expensive cultural overhaul for manufacturers.
I think it's just crucial, though, to recognize the sheer waste the industry was generating before. For years, we saw manufacturers applying intensive, detailed, scripted testing to fundamentally low-risk quality system functions. Think about, minor features in a learning management system, an LMS, or simple routing logic in a CAPA system. The final guidance directly addresses this inefficiency. It provides clarity that aligns validation effort directly with patient safety consequences.
Okay, I understand the desire to reduce over-documentation. I really do. But the core issue for me lies in where the guidance directs that effort. The required high-process risk determination, which then dictates the level of rigorous scripted testing needed. Well, it moves away from the familiar, quantifiable, probabilistic risk assessment defined by ISO 14971, doesn't it? It moves toward one based on, and this is the phrase, profound judgment based on safety consequences. Profound judgment.
And that focus on profound judgment based on safety consequences is exactly the right prioritization. For the vast majority of software features determined to be not high process risk, those LMS or CAPA functions you mentioned, we are now encouraged to use highly efficient, lean methods. This includes leveraging vendor documentation, relying on installation records, and using rapid, unscripted testing methods like exploratory testing, error guessing, or scenario testing. The core shift here is intellectual. It's moving validation resources away from documenting every single step to ensuring sufficient assurance exists based on risk. And that is the foundation for a more agile manufacturing environment.
While that sounds quite ideal on paper, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the shift automatically reduces the compliance risk for the manufacturer. Let me tell you why. The FDA is pushing manufacturers from a system where risk often sits on a spectrum, low, moderate, intermediate, like we see in traditional risk frameworks, to a basically binary classification for CSA, high process risk or not high process risk. Now, for auditors, this forces manufacturers to develop really robust standard operating procedures, SOPs, that institutionalize a consistent definition of that boundary across all their systems. If that discretionary decision for not high risk is poorly justified, well, it creates immediate exposure because the auditor simply has less objective evidence to review regarding the depth of assurance activities.
Okay.
Let's maybe delve deeper into that fundamental distinction then, because the difference between CSA process risk and ISO 14971 medical device risk is deliberate, and I think it's essential. You mentioned 14971, which, as you know, focuses entirely on medical device risk, the potential for harm to the patient or user, and it's often assessed by the likelihood of occurrence, using historical failure data, right?
That probabilistic, quantifiable approach, yes. It offers consistency because the metrics are, well, objective.
But that model just doesn't apply well to production and quality system software failure, does it? Software bugs or configuration errors often lead to deterministic failure. I mean, it fails every time under specific conditions, rather than the random probabilistic failures suitable for historical data modeling. CSO acknowledges this. It focuses instead on process risk. That's about the potential for a failure to compromise the production or quality system itself. It forces us to consider the foreseeable causation. Is this risk reasonably foreseeable, regardless of the statistical likelihood? This distinction, I think, prevents manufacturers from trying to sort of shoehorn complex 14971 probability models into quality system software validation, where they just don't belong.
I agree that the distinction is necessary, conceptually, but the application is where the confusion really arises in practice. Manufacturers now have to move from assessing likelihood, that familiar territory of 14971, to defining a reasonably foreseeable failure in this binary context. And this demands internal alignment on what constitutes that profound judgment. If the SOPs defining this boundary are vague or inconsistent, the risk decision becomes highly challengeable during an audit, because the manufacturer is relying solely on a qualitative interpretation, often lacking those objective metrics you get from probabilistic analysis.
I see why you emphasize consistency, but I would frame it differently. I'd argue that the guidance actually provides specific practical guardrails. The clarity comes from demanding a function-specific analysis that maps process controls directly to the software feature. Let's take the example of an enterprise resource planning system, an ERP, managing materials. Okay? If the ERP automates a critical material acceptance check without any human review, that failure would immediately affect product quality. That makes it high process risk. Simple enough.
Okay, but what if we add a human check?
Exactly. If a qualified quality person physically verifies the material against specifications before use, that human intervention acts as a compensatory control. It prevents the software failure from immediately translating into a quality system compromise. So that human check makes the function's process risk classification drop to not high process risk. And this tangible process mapping is exactly what gives the auditor objective evidence to review. Not just the software code itself, but the existence, the training documentation, and the consistent application of that compensating human process control.
That brings us, I think, directly to the documentation challenge for those not high-risk functions. And this is really the heart of the audit headache for many. When a manufacturer uses, say, error guessing or exploratory testing and submits only a summary description of objectives and maybe failures found, how can I, as the auditor, confirm the rigor? How do I ensure they really explored the 70 or 80 critical failure paths identified in the system analysis, when no steps were actually scripted or recorded? The manufacturer claims they performed sufficient objective evidence testing, but the documentation provided is fundamentally, well, abstract. It's a summary.
Well, the guidance counters that audit challenge, I believe, by asking us to look at the entire quality system, not just the test script in isolation. Manufacturers are explicitly encouraged to leverage additional process controls downstream, things like subsequent inspections, output verification testing, continuous monitoring systems, to actually reduce the assurance needed for the software component itself. So if your final product testing verifies the correct labeling, for example, that verification reduces the assurance burden on the software function that printed the label earlier. Furthermore, the guidance promotes digital efficiency. It says system logs and audit trails should be the objective evidence, not stacks of manual screenshots or paper records.
Okay, but that transition to digital records creates its own significant regulatory hurdle. 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. If those system logs or audit trails are indeed designated as the required objective evidence for validation under Part 820, then Part 11 rules automatically apply. And this is a considerable task, let's be honest. Manufacturers must establish controls to ensure the accuracy, reliability, integrity, availability, and authenticity of those specific digital records. Clarifying the applicability of Part 11 for every single log file generated by a complex integrated system, well, that's not a minor reduction in burden. It's a detailed, potentially time-consuming effort for QA teams.
I acknowledge that establishing Part 11 controls is necessary, yes, for records required under Part 820. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because, well, I'm not convinced the implementation burden outweighs the significant reduction in documentation workload elsewhere. The key shift, I think, is that the documentation for unscripted testing doesn't need those step-by-step scripts anymore. What it must capture is the risk-based justification for the approach, and crucially, the resolution of issues found. So if, during exploratory testing, we find a minor bug, like, say, an input error that allows a non-compliant date format, we document that failure, sure, we document the corrective action, like adding a validation rule to the field, and then we conclude why that failure, before we corrected it, did not actually compromise the intended use of the software. That transparent, risk-based summary is the audit trail the FDA now requires.
Let's shift focus slightly then to external risk, vendor management. This is significantly complicated now by the explicit inclusion of infrastructure, platform, and software as a service, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS in the guidance. This reliance on vendor validation, it pushes substantial responsibility outward, doesn't it? When auditing a manufacturer, I must now verify that their purchasing controls adequately assessed these highly complex, often multi-tenant cloud systems. That includes digging into the vendor's software development lifecycle, their QMS, certifications like ISO certs, and critically, their cybersecurity posture. The lack of visibility into the underlying platform infrastructure, especially in SaaS environments, definitely increases the audit scope considerably.
That clarity on cloud systems is absolutely essential for modern manufacturing today. And the guidance, I think, provides a workable solution based on the shared responsibility model. Look, our responsibility is not to revalidate Microsoft Azure or AWS from scratch. That would be impossible. It is to perform robust vendor assessments, reviewing the vendor's QMS, their accreditations, security risk assessments, and so on, as an initial assurance step. Then we rely heavily on comprehensive service level agreements, SLAs, and quality agreements. These need to define requirements for security, data integrity, and change management specific to our data and our intended use within their environment.
But what about continuous deployment? That's pretty standard for SaaS, right? Automated updates mean the software environment is constantly changing, potentially altering a previously validated state without direct manufacturer control.
Right. And for SaaS solutions with those automated updates, the manufacturer's responsibility becomes manageable, I believe. The guidance implies we assess the vendor's documentation that summarizes the changes. The release notes, security patches they provide. Then we perform risk-based assurance testing commensurate only with the impact identified in those changes. We focus our assurance efforts just on verifying the continued integrity, security, and availability of our data and ensuring that no critical function related to our use has been compromised. This targeted approach prevents the, frankly, needless revalidation of an entire complex product for every minor bug fix. It shifts the regulatory focus from constant retesting to rigorous change management and ongoing monitoring, which seems more practical.
Well, it remains clear to me that while the guidance perhaps aims to reduce the documentation burden, it substantially increases the demand for intellectual rigor and documented judgment. And these are areas where manufacturers are often, let's say, least prepared in defining precise risk boundaries consistently and in managing vendor accountability effectively.
Ultimately, though, the final guidance provides the necessary framework to redirect finite quality resources. It demands intensive effort only on those high process risk features that could foreseeably compromise safety or quality. And it provides explicit permission, finally, for least burdensome assurance for everything else. I see this as a path to modern efficiency provided, and this is key, the risk decisions are transparently justified within the quality management system.
The successful transition to CSA, though, requires more than just procedural updates. It's fundamentally a cultural shift. Manufacturers absolutely must invest heavily in internal alignment, in training, and in developing robust SOPs that clearly articulate the basis for that profound judgment we talked about. They need to ensure that even summary records of unscripted evidence maintain a transparent and, frankly, challenge-proof audit trail.
So the shift to CSA is clearly, well, it's an intellectual undertaking, isn't it? Forcing a much deeper consideration of process risk relative to medical device safety.
Agreed. And there is clearly more to explore in the practical application of these principles, especially as the entire quality management system regulation continues its alignment journey with ISO 1345, expected in 2026. That's another layer to consider.